Well, today's study marks a turning point in the book of Genesis. Up until last week, including last week's, rough story of the of Dinah, um, we've been talking about the family of Abraham and his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as of today, the story of Jacob ends, and the entire rest of the story of the book of Genesis really surrounds Jacob's sons, and particularly Jacob's one son, Joseph. So we're about to shift, with one exception of next week's chapter. We'll talk about that in a moment. With that one exception, the rest of what we're going to look at for the entire rest of the study is going to be the story of Joseph. It's one of the longest, richest, deepest, most beautiful stories in the entire Bible, with a ton of detail. Some stories like the Ark go by in such a short period of time, and Cain and Abel. These are big stories, but they take short periods of time to tell. Joseph's story goes on chapter after chapter after chapter with all kinds of rich and interesting and exciting and important details. So that's what we'll be looking at for the next little while. Today's title is Joseph the Dreamer, and I've designated it as Genesis 35 through 37, but we're going to spend the entire time in 37. So why have I designated it 35 through 37? Well, because the previous one was chapter 34. And in chapters 35 and 36, all that happens is Isaac and Rebecca die, um, and um, and then there's a whole genealogy, and there's just no reason for us to spend time reading through genealogy. Genealogy is extremely important in the Bible. It helps connect the stories together. Researchers go in and they spend all their time in genealogy, but we're not researchers, we're Bible studiers. And so we're going to go into the heart of the story. So we're not discounting it because it has its value. It just isn't something to spend time on in this particular study. So this is entitled chapters 35 through 37, so that when people go through the list and they go, they see all the chapters accounted for. I don't want somebody calling me up in a few months going, hey, we're at chapters 35 and 36, and then having to explain it. It's in the notes, and that's why. So we will be spending our time today in chapter 37. So let's jump right to it, with chapter 37, beginning with verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. This is a major turning point in the story of Genesis and in the story of humanity. Just these few verses that we just read. It's a famous story. Anybody who knows anything about Scripture, and even a lot of people who don't know much about the Bible, have heard about the coat of many colors. That's not how it's referred to in this translation. In this translation, it's referred to as an ornate robe. Either one of those translations is correct. Some translations even use a long sleeved coat, because the Hebrew word can mean any of those things. It can mean ornate, it can mean multicolored, it can mean long sleeves. It's the nature of the Hebrew language, because the Hebrews spent all of their time traveling, and because the Hebrew language was one of the earliest developed. A very few number of words stood in for an awful lot of ideas. They traveled light even with their language. And as time goes on, you add more words instead of taking them out. So very few words to describe a lot of things. So it doesn't really matter. But it was a robe or a coat, and it was multicolored or decorative or long sleeved. And none of those matters. Here's what does matter: the coat or robe that Jacob gave Joseph was how they designated who would lead the family after Jacob died. This would be like a king handing up the prince a scepter, or handing them the family signet on a ring or whatever. Or today, getting the family credit card, or being designated in the family will. That's what this was. And here's how they would divide it up. If there were 12 sons in the family, they would divide up their entire fortune into 13 pieces. So follow me here. 12 sons, 13 pieces. The oldest son would get 2 shares, and the other 11 sons would each get 1 share. This is what the Bible refers to as a double portion. You know the story of Elijah and Elisha, right? Where the one prophet said, I want a double portion of what you had. It doesn't mean twice as much. What it means is I want to carry on the family name of you as the prophet. Just as you were the prophet in Israel, I want to be designated as the next prophet in Israel. So anytime somebody in the Bible asks for a double portion, they're not asking for two times as much as somebody else had. They're asking for the designation as being the leader or the one who carries on the legacy of the family. So in their day, that double portion, so the of the 13 shares divided among 12 sons, the one who was going to lead the family got two shares, everybody else got one. But they also got this coat or robe that designated them as the family leader from that point on. At 17, Joseph is designated by his father to be the one who will carry on the family legacy, even though he's got all of these older brothers. And the oldest, Reuben, by every single thing in their culture, the Reuben would have been the one. He fully would have expected to get the double portion, fully would have expected to get the robe, but instead it goes to the youngest. And why? It says because he loved Joseph more than he loved his other sons. Basically, he was playing favorites. And what happens when he does this is this puts their entire family system into turmoil. Everybody in their culture was raised this way. Everybody in their culture understood that the oldest son was going to be the one to carry on the legacy of the family. The only reason that wouldn't happen is if the oldest son was a thief or a drunk or such a bad liar that nobody could trust them. And it was a huge deal. But then it would always go to the next oldest son, unless that son was a complete mess. And then it would go to the next. So what he's basically saying is, Joseph is, I love him so much that I'm going to treat him as though my other sons, all of you, all 10 of you, because there would be one born later, that the 10 older than him, that the 10 of you are not worthy to carry on the family name. When there's no indication up until this point that they were the kind of people that would not be able to carry on the family name. In fact, before this chapter ends, we're going to find out that at this point, Reuben appears to be actually a very honorable person. There's no reason to pass him over as the person who would carry on the legacy of the family. But he does this not because it says here because he was so much wiser or because Reuben wasn't fit for it, but because he loved him. And why did he love him? Because he was born in his old age and specifically to the wife that he loved the most, to Rachel. This goes all the way back to the baby making contest, right? In Genesis 29 through 30. And that goes back to the deceit by Laban in giving him Leah on the wedding night instead of Rachel. And that goes back to Jacob's own deceit along with his mother against his father and his brother by stealing his father's blessing and his brother's inheritance. All of this is Jacob's is the result of Jacob's own original sins visiting back on the family again. It shows you the consequence, generational consequence that our bad decisions can have. But as we're going to discover going through this beautiful story of Joseph, Joseph determines he's going to break this negative cycle. But at this point, it's still affecting them a whole bunch. So at this point, the reason he picks him isn't because he's the best one of the family necessarily, but because he was born to me in my old age. He was born to me by the woman that I really do love the most. But up until this point, the only thing we know about Joseph is that he's the family snitch. Take a look at it. We just read it in verse 2. It says here, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. He was out in the fields with them and coming back and going, Dad, you wouldn't believe what Gad and Asher did. Right? Not a great way to endear yourself with your older brothers. But that's all we know about him so far. He's 17. He's the family snitch. Dad loves him more. He gets the robe that says you're going to be in charge of the family from this point on. This is a recipe for trouble for Joseph. And as we'll see, it turns into that. Now let's move along. Chapter 37, verse 5. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, Listen to this dream I had. First of all, it's about the most boring thing on the face of the earth for somebody to say, Let me tell you about my dream last night. Right? Every husband and wife knows what it's like to have your spouse tell them about the dream that they had last night. I don't care. Maybe some people are fascinated by dreams. To me, it's the quickest way to get me to have my eyes roll in the back of my head. Anyway, sorry, Shelley, if you're watching this right now. Yeah, that is how I actually feel when you go into detail about your dreams. And I know that's how you feel when I go into detail about mine. Anyway, listen to this dream I had. Verse 7. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Now, you don't need to be much of a dream interpreter to know exactly what that means, right? And so his brothers do. Verse 8. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Notice, they don't just hate him because of the dream, they hate him because he told them the dream, because of his dream and what he had said. Like, you had the dream, be quiet about it. We wouldn't know, but you're telling us for a reason, dude, right? Verse 9. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Remember, he's only a teenager. He's not really exhibiting the greatest of smarts right now. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So at this point, it's not just the sheaves, it's of the moon and sun as well, which means what? Well, they know what it means. Verse 10. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him. His father, who loved him more than anybody else, rebuked him and said, what is this the dream? What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So Joseph can't help having dreams. None of us can help having dreams. Whatever we have in our dreams is what we have in our dreams. We have little, if any, control over them at all. But you can help who you tell it to. And especially after the reaction to the first one is so bad, dude, don't tell him the second one. There is nothing in the story that requires him to tell those dreams to his brothers. There isn't. God didn't say, now that you've had the dream, tell your brothers. That's not in the passage at all. He's just, at this point, it appears like unwise and bragging. But these are prophecies that, as we'll see by the end of the story, will actually come true. So before we move along, though, let's talk about something that a lot of people ask questions about, especially in this part of the Bible. What is it with dreams in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament? They almost disappear entirely, except a couple reference in prophecy. They almost disappear entirely in the New Testament. Not entirely. There are a couple dreams that direct people, but they're not as frequent in the New Testament, and they're certainly very frequent in the Joseph story. So, what's the deal with dreams, especially in the Old Testament? Well, before we had the Bible, this was one of the main ways that God talked to his people. We don't rely on dreams to hear from God today because we have the Bible. Right? God, speak to me. Speak to me in a dream. Well, pick up the book. I don't need dreams. I have a Bible in my house. I have several Bibles in my house. I have it on my phone. I have it on my laptop. I can access the Bible anywhere at any time. What do I need dreams for when I've got the Bible? So back then, they received direction in dreams more often because they didn't have the Bible. At this point in Joseph's story, not a single verse of the Bible has been written, not a single word. Right? None of it's happened yet. So, yes, God can speak in dreams today. I believe sometimes God does speak in dreams today. But today, we measure the truth of everything, including dreams, against God's word. Back then, they just had to take it for granted this was God. Today, if you have a dream and you check it against God's word and it doesn't go with God's word, well, then the dream didn't mean anything from God. It was just, bad sausage the night before. Okay? That's all it is. Yes, today, God can still speak in dreams. He doesn't all that often because he doesn't need to, because we have the Bible. So we measure everything against God's word, including our dreams, including the advice of others, including everything, including our circumstances and our own ideas and our own wise thoughts. If it doesn't match up with scripture, we reject it. They didn't have it then, so the dreams meant more to them then. So we continue on now, chapter 37, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. They were shepherds, so they would often have to travel many, many, many miles, days away from their home base to find fresh fields that hadn't already been grazed by the animals. Okay, so they're gone, they're grazing their sheep, right, to graze with their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring back word to me. Basically, he's sending him to be a snitch again. Okay, that's what he's doing. End of verse 14 now. Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here." The man answered, "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" Now, this is a weird detail that for years I would read and go, why does the Bible tell us about this guy who gives him directions? Who cares? He eventually finds his brother. So why do we care about somebody giving him directions? Okay. Here's a couple reasons why. Why does the Bible tell us about the man giving Joseph directions? First of all, because it happened. This is one of the distinctions between fiction and nonfiction. In fiction, every single detail has to matter. Otherwise, leave it out because it just bogs the story down. In nonfiction, that is, telling stories that actually happened, often you'll tell things that happened that don't pay off later. Why? Because when you realize in real life, a whole bunch of stuff doesn't pay off later. A whole bunch of things happen that don't necessarily mean something later. This will mean something later. Okay. But the first reason that it's told this way, and in fact, as we'll see through the story of Joseph, a whole bunch of detail, it also shows us how helpless Joseph was at this time. Take a look. It isn't just a guy giving him directions. Take a look at what it says. A man found him wandering around in the fields. So his dad says they're near Shechem. He goes to Shechem and go, I don't see them. And he's wandering in fields looking for them. Anybody who was wise about herds and flocks and going from place to place would have known the telltale clues. I wouldn't know how. I was probably I'd be dumber on that than Joseph, but I don't live in an agricultural society like Joseph did. So Joseph didn't know how to look for the telltale clues of where his brothers might have taken the flocks. There could be thousands of sheep, and there are 10 of them. You got 10 older brothers. Benjamin would have still been at home with mom and dad. So 10 men with maybe thousands of flocks. If you can't find that in their culture, then you don't know what you're doing. So in fact, at this point, it doesn't even say then he went to look for advice. He's not even wary enough to say, let me ask somebody. He's wandering in fields and a stranger comes up and goes, are you okay? Do you need help? It's, he's that helpless in that point. And this matters, as we'll see later in the story. Okay. It continues on, end of verse 17. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Wow. So why do they hate him so much? They say so in the passage. Here comes that dreamer. That's what they hate about him. Joseph's brothers hated him for his dreams. Now, why would they hate him for his dreams? Because those dreams foretold the end result of their father's favoritism. Right? They first started hating him because he was a snitch. Then they really started hating him because dad said he's going to be the one who runs the family after I'm dead. Then they doubled down on that hatred when he told them one dream that you're going to bow down towards me someday. And then they really hated him when he had a second dream and still told them again. So here's the kid who doesn't even know how to find thousands of flocks out in the field, right? And who doesn't know, isn't wise enough to shush about dreams to his brothers that he shouldn't be telling them. And he's the one who's going to lead the family when dad's dead, right? So they are not happy about that idea at all. And from a natural human standpoint, you can understand why, I think. Okay. So continues on, chapter 37, verse 21. When Reuben heard this, that is, they're going to kill him. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Now, here's what's really important about this part of the story. The one who tried to save him was Reuben. And who was Reuben? The oldest. Reuben was the one who had the most reason to hate him because Reuben was the one who was going to lead the family until Joseph got the robe. Reuben has lost the most, which underlines the question, why then did Jacob want to give the family legacy to Joseph, who was a snitch, who didn't know how to run the family business. He couldn't even find the flocks in a field. When you've got someone who's older and wiser, is already been running the family, because that's what you would do your entire life as the older brother, and especially in their society, he would have run everything. And he's an honorable enough man to say, I'm going to try to save my brother's life from my other brothers, even though he's the one who would have the most reason to want to kill him. Right? Joseph dies, and who's going to take over the family? Reuben. But Reuben says, I want to save. So Reuben is an honorable man. There's no reason for him to have been bypassed. And I think that's just a really important and actually beautiful part of the story, that Reuben's a really good guy. Okay, let's move along to verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, so that you're designated. He wasn't just wearing any robe. He goes out into the fields wearing a ceremonial robe, right? You get the ceremonial robe, and usually then you only wear it for special occasions. Big family dinner, like today would be Thanksgiving with the family, right? Or you don't wear that robe every day, and you certainly don't wear the robe when you're searching in the fields for shepherds. You should have worn an everyday robe, but no, he's bragging. He's showing it off. He shows up with the robe, and they're looking at him like, dude, you got to be kidding me. Really, this is just showing off. So they're really angry. So they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Now, we see cistern, or sometimes it's called well, depending on your translation, same thing. And we don't think much of it. Okay, they threw him in a hole in the ground, fine. It was a well. But this one had no water in it. So, all good. So he wasn't up to his neck in water. No, he wasn't up to his neck in water, but guess what they did with empty wells and cisterns after they ran out of water? First of all, you dig the well or cistern to get water. And once the well ran out of water, I want you to imagine yourself as a shepherd out in the fields day after day, sleeping out under the stars, under a tree at night. And during the day after you've eaten, what do you need to do? You got to go to the bathroom. Well, there's no outhouses. And you're not just going to go in the middle of a field where you might step in it later. So what do? You go in the abandoned, empty cistern. He was thrown in the toilet. This would have been about as nasty a thing as you could possibly have been thrown into. And the Bible specifies that it was a well with no water in it, which means everybody in their culture at that time knew exactly where he was being thrown. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, they took the robe off of him beforehand. You don't want to get the robe dirty. Okay. So the cistern or well they threw Joseph in was empty. It would have been used as the toilet. They took the robe off first. And this is just the first of several really, really, really bad things that are about to happen to Joseph in his life. Let's continue with the story. Chapter 37, verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, so they take Joseph, they determine they're going to kill him. They remove the robe, they throw him in the toilet. And who knows, was he up to his knees, up to his waist in this human filth? We don't know. And then they sit down and have a meal. That's how little they care about their little brother, okay? 37:25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, people traveling all over, right? Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. They knew the Ishmaelites were slave traders, and Ishmaelites heading to Egypt would have had slaves with them to sell to the Egyptians. So they're thinking, here's a quick way to get rid of him. We can get money out of him. We won't have any blood on our hands, and they're going to offload him in Egypt, and we won't have to ever think about him again. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. I don't know how that's not laying hands on him, but right, that's the pretzel logic your brain goes through to try to get away with bad stuff, right? After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Well, he's our brother. We shouldn't actually kill him. Let's just sell him as a slave. His brothers agreed. Verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. So Reuben obviously was not having lunch with the brothers when they came up with this plan. He was off somewhere else. As the leader of the family at that point, the oldest, he was probably off doing something important business or whatever. He comes back. He wants to save his brother. He sees he's not in the cistern and he tears his clothes, which is a sign of grief. Verse 30, he went back to his brothers and says, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Like, what have you done? I had a plan. I was going to rescue him. Everything was going to be okay. And now you've really ruined everything because now I can't even save the day on this one. I can't save our brother. And quite frankly, I can't save you from having this blood on your hands. So selling him into slavery technically removes his death from their hands, but not really. Selling Joseph into slavery was a legal loophole, but it did not remove their guilt. And we do that all the time, don't we? Right, right. Oh, it's not technically a lie if I say, oh, come on. We all know if the intention is deceit, it's a lie, even if technically the words you say are true. Same thing here. Okay, technically they weren't the ones to actually plunge a knife into his chest or, however they were planning to kill him. We'll let someone else kill him. They sent him off to his death rather than doing it themselves. And even though legally, technically, there's a loophole there, it doesn't relieve them of any of the guilt. And now it removes from Reuben the chance to save Joseph. Verse 31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see if it is your son's robe." Like they didn't know, right? He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Here is why that little piece about finding Joseph wandering in the field matters. That little story tells us how ill-equipped Joseph is to be out in the fields. He's a house kid. He's not a field kid, right? He's not the son who goes out in the field. And just like the difference between his previous ancestors, right? Esau and Esau and Jacob, right? Esau was the guy who was loved by dad because he was out there and a hunter, and Jacob was the house kid who was loved by mom, and now Jacob loves the house kid as well, right? Same thing. Um, this shows us why this story works. Jacob knew that Joseph was the one who was likely going to be wandering in the field. We, as the story hearers, don't know that. So the storyteller tells us that detail to let us know, oh, this kid is what we would call a tenderfoot, right? He doesn't know his way around outside. So that when Jacob gets the robe, and it looks like Joseph was torn apart by wild animals, it's believable because Joseph didn't know his way in the wilderness, right? If they'd come back with a torn robe for Gad or Asher or Naphtali or any of the other guys, a trained shepherd is not going to be torn by wild animals. They know how to defend themselves. But for Joseph, it's completely believable story. Okay, so and this is just the first of many spots over the next few weeks where we're going to see extreme detail in the story of Joseph, and the extreme detail throughout Joseph's story emphasizes that his story is history and not fiction. As we go through it, we'll see a whole bunch of that. Why are you telling this part of the story? Why are you telling it this way? Because that's how it happened. Because we're relating history. We're not just making up a story for you. Now, it's tempting, given the start of the story, to want to jump to the rest of Joseph's story right away. And we often do that. I just recently did that in church on a Sunday morning. But this is not a Sunday morning sermon. This is a chapter by chapter study. So we're not going to skip anything. We went quickly, obviously, through 34 and 35 today, or was it? Yeah, 35 and 36 today. But there's a story next week that is important. So we'll come back to Joseph 2 weeks from now for a couple of reasons. One, because we'll have the different story next week, which we'll look at in a moment, or tease to you in a moment, as they say in the business. But also because a passage of a couple of weeks while Joseph's in Potiphar's house gives us a sense of some of the passage of time that Joseph had. This story didn't happen quickly for him. It took a long time to unfold. So it's important for us to take a little while to see it unfold in the week by week way that we'll be looking at it. But before that, next week we will take one chapter. It'll be the last chapter that takes an aside from the main narrative of Genesis. And we're going to look at the strange and interesting and difficult at times story of Judah and Tamar. That's next week. We'll see you then.